"You cannot be serious, Dad." I choked out when he declared I would never be part of our family law firm. "This is final. The firm goes to your brother. This is not for a woman." I had spent my entire life preparing for this moment, dreaming of seeing my nameplate beside his on the mahogany door. He did not care about my summa cum laude degree from Northwestern Law or my perfect bar exam scores. I walked out that day with nothing but my bar exam notes, leaving behind everything I had worked toward my entire life. Standing in that familiar office where I had spent countless childhood afternoons, I could barely comprehend what had just happened. The mahogany-paneled walls that once felt warm and welcoming now seemed cold and forbidding. Family photographs lined the credenza behind my father's desk, showing 3 generations of Sullivan men who had built this practice from nothing into Chicago's premier family law firm. My great-grandfather Patrick Sullivan had founded Sullivan and Associates in 1945, fresh out of law school, and determined to help working-class families navigate divorce and custody battles. He started with a single room above Murphy's Deli on the South Side, taking cases other attorneys would not touch. Through sheer determination and genuine compassion for his clients, he built a reputation that stretched across the entire city. My grandfather Thomas expanded the practice in the 1970s, moving to the prestigious downtown location where we still operated. He specialized in complex property division cases and became known for his meticulous attention to detail. Under his leadership, the firm grew to employ 6 attorneys and handle some of the most high-profile divorce cases in Illinois. Then came my father William, who transformed Sullivan and Associates into the powerhouse it became. He developed innovative mediation techniques that saved clients millions in court costs while preserving family relationships. Legal publications featured his work regularly, and law schools invited him to lecture on family law ethics. The firm now employed 15 attorneys and support staff, occupying 3 floors of a Michigan Avenue high-rise. Growing up, I absorbed every detail of this legacy. During school breaks, I would accompany my father to the office organizing case files and listening to him explain legal strategies. He would quiz me on statutory requirements and smile proudly when I grasped complex concepts that impressed visiting attorneys. I remember being 7 years old, carefully arranging discovery documents while he prepared for a major custody hearing. "This is the future Mrs. Catherine Sullivan," he would tell colleagues, introducing me with obvious pride. "She's going to carry on the family tradition and probably surpass us all." Those words became my North Star, guiding every academic decision and career choice throughout my youth. I excelled in high school debate, winning state championships and earning a full scholarship to Northwestern University. My undergraduate political science professors praised my analytical skills and encouraged me to pursue law school immediately after graduation. I studied constantly, maintaining a 4.0 grade point average while volunteering at legal aid clinics and internships at prestigious firms. Law school proved even more demanding, but I thrived under the pressure. Constitutional law fascinated me, and I spent hours in the library researching landmark family law cases. My professors selected me for the Law Review editorial board, and I graduated summa cum laude with honors in family law specialization. The Illinois bar examination felt like a formality after years of intensive preparation. Meanwhile, my younger brother Danny had shown absolutely zero interest in legal work throughout his childhood and adolescence. He barely graduated from high school, spending most of his time playing video games and hanging out with friends who shared his lack of ambition. Community college became his reluctant compromise after our parents refused to support his plans to skip higher education entirely. Danny struggled through basic coursework, changing majors 3 times before settling on general studies. He showed no curiosity about the law firm that had shaped our family's identity for 3 generations. Family dinners often featured my enthusiastic discussions about interesting cases or legal developments, while Danny remained silent or excused himself early to meet friends. The irony was not lost on me that the son who had avoided everything connected to our family's profession would now inherit the practice that I had devoted my entire life to joining. The brother who could barely explain the difference between civil and criminal law would lead attorneys who respected the Sullivan name because of the expertise and integrity it represented. But the most shocking revelation came when Danny smirked from the corner of my father's office during that devastating conversation. His expression revealed something I had never suspected, a calculated satisfaction that suggested this outcome had not happened by accident. The pieces began falling into place as I realized my own brother had been working against me behind the scenes, manipulating our father's decision through means I could not yet comprehend. As I gathered my belongings from the office that day, my hands trembling with anger and disbelief, I caught a glimpse of correspondence on my father's desk. The letterhead belonged to Morrison Black and Associates, one of Chicago's most established family law practices. The visible portion mentioned discussions about transitioning certain clients and maintaining professional relationships during upcoming changes at Sullivan and Associates. This discovery hit me like a physical blow. Not only was I being excluded from the family firm, but arrangements were already underway to manage the aftermath of this decision. My father had been planning this betrayal for weeks, or possibly months, discussing the firm's future with outside parties, while allowing me to believe I still had a place in the family legacy. The elevator ride down from the 30th floor felt endless. Each floor that passed represented another layer of my shattered dreams. By the time I reached the parking garage, the full weight of my situation had settled over me like a suffocating blanket. Everything I had worked for, every sacrifice I had made, every assumption I had built my future around, had crumbled in the space of a 10-minute conversation. I drove straight to Danny's apartment complex, my mind racing with questions that demanded immediate answers. The building was a modest 3-story structure in Lincoln Park, nothing fancy, but respectable enough for someone supposedly preparing to inherit a multi-million-dollar law practice. The contrast between his humble living situation and his sudden elevation to firm leadership struck me as suspicious. Danny answered his door with the same smug expression he had worn in our father's office. He wore wrinkled jeans and a faded concert t-shirt, hardly the appearance of someone ready to assume professional responsibilities. His apartment was cluttered with empty pizza boxes and gaming equipment, the living space of someone who had never taken adult responsibilities seriously. "Come to gloat about your victory," I asked, pushing past him into the cramped living room. "Victory." Danny laughed, settling onto his worn couch with unsettling confidence. "Catherine, this was never a competition. Dad finally realized what everyone else could see clearly. You would ruin the firm's reputation within 5 years." His casual dismissal of my qualifications stung, but I pressed forward with my real questions. "How did you convince him you have never shown the slightest interest in practicing law? Most days you cannot even remember to pay your electric bill on time." Danny's expression shifted, and for the first time I glimpsed something resembling genuine emotion. Desperation flickered across his features before he regained his composure. He walked to a kitchen drawer and pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. "You want to know how I convinced him I told him the truth about what clients really think when they see a woman handling their divorce cases? Men do not trust female attorneys with their financial futures, and women worry that other women will judge their personal decisions too harshly. Traditional families want traditional representation." The folder contained printed emails and what appeared to be client surveys, though I suspected their authenticity. Danny had clearly spent considerable time crafting arguments that would appeal to our father's old-fashioned sensibilities. But there was something else in his demeanor, an underlying panic that suggested deeper motivations than professional concerns. "I need this firm, Catherine." Danny's voice dropped to a more urgent tone. "You have options with your grades and connections. You could work anywhere in the city. I have gambling debts that are going to get me killed if I do not find a way to pay them back soon." There it was. the truth behind his sudden interest in family law and his campaign to exclude me from the practice. Danny pulled out his phone and showed me a series of text messages that made my blood run cold. The threats were explicit and detailed, demanding $50,000 within 6 weeks or promising consequences that would extend beyond financial penalties. I got involved with some people who run poker games in the warehouse district. He explained his earlier confidence completely evaporated. It started as weekend entertainment, but the stakes kept getting higher. Before I knew it, I owed more money than I could ever repay on my own. The loan sharks behind these messages were not the kind of people who accepted payment plans or showed mercy for financial hardship. They operated outside legal boundaries and resolved disputes through intimidation and violence. Danny had gotten himself entangled with genuine criminals who would not hesitate to hurt him or his family if their demands went unmet. But even understanding his desperate circumstances, I could not forgive what he had done next. Danny reached into his backpack and produced a folder containing documents that bore my signature on letterhead from Sullivan and Associates. The papers indicated my voluntary withdrawal from consideration for partnership and my enthusiastic endorsement of Danny's appointment as the firm's heir apparent. "I never signed any of these documents," I said, examining the forgeries more closely. The signatures looked convincing, but I remembered every piece of correspondence I had ever submitted to my father regarding my career plans. "No, you did not," Danny admitted with a shrug. "But Dad believes you did. He thinks you realized on your own that you were not suited for the demands of running a family practice. These letters convinced him that you had come to your senses and wanted what was best for the Sullivan legacy." The betrayal was deeper than I had imagined. Not only had Danny poisoned our father's mind against me, but he had manufactured evidence to support his lies. He had forged my signature on documents that painted me as someone who lacked confidence in my own abilities and willingly deferred to male authority in professional matters. Looking around his cluttered apartment, I noticed other troubling signs of his financial desperation. Credit card statements lay scattered across his coffee table, showing balances that exceeded his income by enormous margins. Collection agency notices were taped to his refrigerator, and I spotted pawn shop receipts for items that probably belonged to our parents. Danny had been spiraling into financial ruin for months while keeping his troubles hidden from our family. The gambling debts were just the most recent and most dangerous chapter in a longer story of fiscal irresponsibility. Taking over the law firm represented his only hope of accessing enough money to satisfy his creditors and escape the violent consequences of his poor choices. But as I prepared to leave his apartment, Danny delivered one final revelation that left me completely speechless. He showed me records indicating that he had already begun accessing Sullivan and Associates' financial accounts, using his position as the designated heir to authorize small withdrawals and transfers that he hoped would go unnoticed until he could establish more permanent control over the firm's resources. This is not just about inheritance anymore, I realized. You are already stealing from the practice, while Dad remains completely unaware of what you are doing. Danny's silence confirmed my suspicions. He had moved beyond simple manipulation and forgery into actual embezzlement. The family firm that had taken 3 generations to build was being systematically looted by someone who saw it only as a solution to his personal financial crisis. Driving home from Danny's apartment, I felt a crushing need to talk to someone who would understand the magnitude of what had just happened. My mother, Patricia, had always been my confidant during difficult times, the person who offered perspective and emotional support when life became overwhelming. Surely she would see the injustice of this situation and help me find a way to make my father reconsider his decision. I found her in the kitchen of my childhood home preparing dinner with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized her approach to everything throughout my youth. The familiar sounds and smells of her cooking normally brought me comfort, but today they felt like reminders of a family stability that no longer existed. "Mom, I need to talk to you about what happened at the office today." I began settling onto the bar stool where I had done homework and shared secrets throughout my teenage years. Patricia continued chopping vegetables without looking up, her knife moving with practiced precision. "I know about your father's decision, Catherine. He discussed it with me several weeks ago, and I told him I supported his choice completely." The casual way she delivered this information hit me harder than my father's original rejection. Not only had both parents collaborated in excluding me from the family business, but my mother had been part of the planning process, while I remained completely unaware of their intentions. "You knew this was going to happen and said nothing," I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. "You let me believe I still had a future with the firm while you were helping Dad arrange my professional exile." Patricia finally looked up, her expression displaying a mixture of sympathy and resignation that I found deeply unsettling. She wiped her hands on a kitchen towel and sat across from me with the air of someone preparing to deliver difficult but necessary truths. "Catherine, I love you dearly, but you have always been unrealistic about what practicing law would actually mean for your future happiness. Running a demanding practice is incompatible with the kind of family life that brings true fulfillment to women. Your father and I want to protect you from making choices you would eventually regret." The condescension in her tone was unmistakable. Despite my academic achievements and professional qualifications, she still viewed me as someone who needed protection from my own ambitions. The assumption that career success and personal happiness were mutually exclusive for women revealed attitudes I had never suspected in someone I respected and admired. But there was something else in her demeanor that suggested deeper, more personal motivations behind her position. Patricia walked to the family room and retrieved a photo album I had not seen in years. The pages contained images from her own college graduation, an early career as a high school English teacher, a time when she had been passionate about education and literature. "I gave up my teaching career when your father's practice began expanding," she explained, pointing to pictures that showed her obvious enthusiasm for her work. "I convinced myself it was temporary, that I would return to the classroom once you children were older. But years passed, and the firm needed more support, and somehow I never made it back to the profession I loved." The bitterness in her voice revealed wounds that had never properly healed. Patricia had sacrificed her own professional aspirations to support my father's career growth, and now she was projecting that experience onto my situation. In her mind, preventing me from pursuing demanding legal work would spare me the disappointment and resentment she had carried for decades. "You want me to find a nice supporting role at another firm and focus on finding a husband," I said, repeating the suggestion she had made during our phone conversation the previous week. "You think professional ambition will ultimately leave me empty and unfulfilled?" Patricia nodded, her expression softening with what she clearly believed was maternal wisdom. "I have watched your father work 70-hour weeks for 30 years, missing family dinners and vacation trips because clients needed immediate attention. I have seen how the stress affects his health and our relationship. Why would I want that kind of life for my daughter?" But the most shocking revelation came when she walked to her writing desk and retrieved a manila envelope that had been carefully stored in the bottom drawer. The contents included a handwritten letter dated 5 years earlier, addressed to my father and bearing her signature at the bottom. "I wrote this when you were finishing your second year of law school," she said, handing me the pages with obvious reluctance. "I was hoping your father would find a gentle way to discourage you from continuing your legal education." Reading my mother's words was like discovering that someone I trusted completely had been working against my interests for years. The letter argued that encouraging my legal career would ultimately harm my chances for marriage and family happiness. She suggested that my father should guide me toward more traditionally feminine professions like teaching or social work. The letter also revealed that Patricia had been discussing my future with other family members and friends, building consensus around the idea that legal practice was inappropriate for women who wanted fulfilling personal lives. She had solicited opinions from relatives and neighbors who supported her view that professional demands would prevent me from becoming a proper wife and mother. "You have been sabotaging my career for years while pretending to support my goals," I said, the full scope of the betrayal finally becoming clear. "Every time you asked about my studies or seemed interested in my progress, you were actually gathering information to use against me." Patricia's expression remained calm, as if she genuinely believed her actions had been motivated by love and concern, rather than manipulation and deceit. In her worldview, protecting me from professional challenges was an act of maternal caring, even if it required undermining my stated goals and aspirations. The conversation continued for another hour, but nothing she said could repair the fundamental breach of trust that had occurred. My mother had not only failed to support my professional ambitions, but had actively worked to undermine them while maintaining the pretense of being my advocate and confidant. As I prepared to leave my childhood home that evening, Patricia made one final attempt to justify her position. She reminded me of family friends whose daughters had struggled to balance demanding careers with marriage and motherhood, citing their experiences as evidence that my goals were fundamentally unrealistic. But what she failed to understand was that her interference had not protected me from difficult choices. Instead, it had denied me the opportunity to make those choices myself based on my own values and priorities, rather than her fears and regrets about the path her life had taken. The following Monday morning, I began the humbling process of job hunting in Chicago's competitive legal market. Armed with an impressive resume and sterling academic credentials, I assumed finding suitable employment would be a temporary setback rather than a long-term obstacle. The city was home to hundreds of law firms, from massive corporate practices to boutique specialty shops, surely offering plenty of opportunities for someone with my qualifications. My first target was Morrison Black and Associates, the firm whose letterhead I had glimpsed on my father's desk. They specialized in family law and had a reputation for handling complex divorce cases involving significant assets and custody disputes. Their website featured testimonials from satisfied clients and profiles of attorneys who seemed to share my commitment to protecting families during difficult transitions. The receptionist scheduled an interview for Thursday afternoon with James Morrison, the founding partner, whose name appeared first on the firm's letterhead. I spent 3 days researching recent cases they had handled, and developing thoughtful questions about their approach to client representation and professional development opportunities. Morrison's office occupied the corner of the 22nd floor with floor-to-ceiling windows offering spectacular views of Lake Michigan. Law books lined the walls, and framed diplomas and awards testified to his successful career, spanning nearly 4 decades. He was a distinguished man in his early 60s, with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to commanding respect in professional settings. The interview began promisingly. Morrison praised my academic achievements and asked thoughtful questions about my law school experiences and career goals. He seemed particularly interested in my research on innovative mediation techniques and nodded approvingly when I discussed my commitment to helping families navigate divorce proceedings with dignity and minimal trauma. But the atmosphere shifted when our conversation moved to practical matters like start dates and compensation expectations. Morrison leaned back in his chair and studied me with an expression that I could not immediately interpret. Something in his demeanor had changed, and I sensed that the interview was not proceeding as successfully as I had initially believed. "Miss Sullivan, your qualifications are certainly impressive, and I can see that you have invested considerable effort in preparing for a legal career. However, I have some concerns about whether our practice would be the right fit for your particular circumstances and long-term goals." The vague nature of his concerns puzzled me. Nothing in our conversation had suggested any fundamental incompatibilities between my interests and their practice areas. I asked for clarification, hoping to address whatever reservations had emerged during our discussion. Morrison stood and walked to his window, gazing out at the lake while he formulated his response. Family law can be an extremely demanding field, especially for young women who may eventually want to balance professional responsibilities with marriage and family obligations. Many of our cases require weekend work and evening client meetings that can be difficult to accommodate alongside personal commitments. The coded language was unmistakable. He was suggesting that my gender made me inherently less suitable for the demands of legal practice, regardless of my individual qualifications or career dedication. The assumption that I would inevitably prioritize family responsibilities over professional excellence revealed biases that I had hoped were fading from the legal profession. Perhaps you might consider applying for paralegal positions where you could utilize your legal knowledge in a more flexible environment. Morrison continued, returning to his desk with a patronizing smile. Those roles often provide better work-life balance for women who want to contribute meaningfully to legal work without the full pressures of attorney responsibilities. I maintained my composure during the remainder of our meeting, but internally I was reeling from the casual way he had dismissed my career aspirations. This was not a frank discussion about practice demands or client expectations. It was a polite but unmistakable suggestion that women belonged in supporting roles rather than leadership positions within legal practices. The next two interviews followed disturbingly similar patterns. Hartford and Associates expressed enthusiasm about my academic record, but ultimately suggested that I might be happier at smaller firms with less demanding schedules. Brennan Legal Services questioned whether I had realistic expectations about the physical and emotional demands of family law practice. By Friday afternoon, I was beginning to suspect that something beyond normal market competition was affecting my job search. The rejections were too consistent and too focused on gender-related concerns that should have been irrelevant given my qualifications. Moreover, the specific nature of their comments suggested they had received information about me that went beyond my submitted application materials. My suspicions were confirmed when I returned to Morrison's building later that week to retrieve a portfolio I had accidentally left behind. While waiting for the elevator, I heard a familiar voice echoing from the stairwell. James Morrison was engaged in an animated phone conversation that became clearer as I moved closer to the door. "William, I appreciate you giving me advance notice about your daughter's situation. I certainly understand your position and agree that it would be inappropriate for us to undermine your family's internal decisions by offering her employment opportunities that might create ongoing conflicts." The conversation continued, but I had heard enough to understand what was happening. My father had contacted Morrison and presumably other firm leaders, sharing information about my rejection from Sullivan and Associates, while framing it in terms that discouraged them from hiring me. He was using his professional relationships and reputation to sabotage my job search across the entire Chicago legal community. The realization that my own father was actively working to destroy my career prospects was devastating. Not content with excluding me from the family firm, he was ensuring that I would struggle to find suitable employment anywhere else in the city. His influence extended throughout Chicago's legal circles, and his implicit criticism of my abilities was poisoning potential opportunities before I could even present my qualifications. As I rode the elevator down to street level, the full scope of my situation became clear. This was not simply about one firm's hiring decision or even broader gender discrimination within the legal profession. My father had launched a systematic campaign to prevent me from practicing law in Chicago, using his reputation and professional connections to block my access to the career I had spent years preparing to pursue. The 3 rejections I had received were just the beginning. Every prestigious firm in the city would likely receive similar communications warning them away from hiring the daughter whom William Sullivan had deemed unsuitable for legal practice. My rejection from the family firm was not just a personal disappointment, but a professional scarlet letter that would follow me throughout the local legal community. Desperation drove me to spend the weekend researching every law firm in the Chicago metropolitan area, expanding my search to include suburban practices and smaller specialty shops that might be less influenced by my father's professional network. I created detailed spreadsheets tracking application deadlines, practice areas, and partner backgrounds, hoping to identify opportunities where his influence might carry less weight. During this research, I decided to investigate Danny's background more thoroughly, hoping to find information that might help me understand how someone with his limited qualifications had convinced our father to hand him control of a prestigious legal practice. If I could document his unfitness for the position, perhaps I could still persuade my father to reconsider his decision. I started with basic internet searches looking for any public records or mentions of Danny's name in local databases. What I found was far more alarming than anything I had expected to discover. The Chicago Tribune's online police blotter from 6 months earlier contained a brief mention of Daniel Sullivan being questioned in connection with an illegal gambling operation that had been raided by Chicago Police Department detectives. The article provided minimal details, but it confirmed that Danny had been present when authorities shut down an underground poker game in a warehouse near the Southside Industrial District. While no charges were filed against him, the fact that he was questioned suggested his involvement went beyond casual participation in what police described as a sophisticated illegal gambling enterprise. Further research revealed additional troubling information. Court records showed that Danny had been named as a defendant in 3 small claims cases over the past 18 months, all involving unpaid debts to individuals whose names I did not recognize. The amounts were relatively modest, ranging from $800 to $1,500, but the pattern suggested ongoing financial irresponsibility. I decided to conduct physical surveillance following Danny during his evening activities to see if I could gather more concrete evidence about his gambling habits and financial situation. This felt uncomfortably like stalking my own brother, but the stakes were too high for me to rely on assumptions or incomplete information. Thursday evening, I parked across from his apartment building and waited for him to emerge. Danny appeared around 8 o'clock, dressed more formally than usual in dark jeans and a button-down shirt. He drove to a strip mall in Cicero, parking behind a restaurant that appeared to be closed for business. Several other cars were already in the lot, and I watched as men entered the building through a rear entrance. Over the next 3 hours, I observed a steady stream of visitors arriving and departing from what was clearly an illegal gambling operation. The participants ranged from young men in their 20s to older individuals who looked like successful business people. Cash changed hands in the parking lot, and the tension was evident even from my distant observation point. When Danny finally emerged, his body language told a story of significant losses. He walked slowly to his car, shoulders slumped, and sat behind the wheel for several minutes before starting the engine. I followed him to a 24-hour diner where he sat alone in a booth, staring at his phone with an expression of genuine fear. The next day, I decided to search his car while he was at work. Danny had always been careless about locking his vehicle, and I found it parked outside the community college where he worked part-time as a maintenance assistant. The glove compartment and center console contained a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. Pawnshop receipts showed that Danny had been systematically selling personal possessions over the past year. Wedding gifts from our parents' electronics and even family heirlooms had been converted to cash to fund his gambling habit. The receipts totaled nearly $12,000, representing a substantial portion of everything valuable he owned. But the most shocking discovery was a collection of bank statements and financial documents that revealed the true extent of his desperation. Danny had been writing checks from accounts that lacked sufficient funds, resulting in overdraft fees that compounded his financial problems. More alarmingly, several of the checks were written on accounts belonging to Sullivan and Associates, using signature cards he had somehow obtained access to. The forgeries were sophisticated enough to pass casual inspection, but they represented clear evidence of embezzlement from the family firm. Danny had been stealing money from client trust accounts, using his knowledge of office procedures and his access as the designated heir to authorize withdrawals that he hoped would go unnoticed until he could establish permanent control over the firm's finances. One particularly damaging document was a letter from the Illinois Attorney Registration and Disciplinary Commission, informing Danny that complaints had been filed against Sullivan and Associates regarding mishandling of client funds. The letter requested detailed accounting records and explanations for several suspicious transactions that had triggered automatic reporting requirements. Danny was not just stealing money to pay gambling debts. His activities were exposing the entire firm to regulatory scrutiny that could result in disciplinary action against my father and the other attorneys who worked there. The family business that had taken 3 generations to build was being systematically destroyed by someone who viewed it only as a source of ready cash for his personal financial crisis. I photographed all the evidence with my phone, creating a comprehensive record of Danny's criminal activities. The documentation showed a clear pattern of escalating financial desperation that had led him from casual gambling to serious felony crimes. His theft of client funds violated multiple state and federal laws, and his forgery of official documents added additional criminal charges to his growing list of legal vulnerabilities. But as I prepared to confront my father with this evidence, I discovered one final piece of information that made the situation even more urgent. Hidden beneath the car's spare tire was a manila envelope containing correspondence from federal authorities. The FBI had opened an investigation into money laundering activities connected to the illegal gambling operation, where Danny was a regular participant. The letter indicated that Danny was considered a person of interest in a broader investigation, targeting organized crime figures who used gambling operations to launder proceeds from other illegal activities. Federal agents had been monitoring his financial transactions and were building a case that could result in serious federal charges, carrying potential prison sentences measured in decades rather than years. Danny was not just risking his own future through his criminal activities. His involvement with federal investigations was creating legal exposure for every member of our family and every attorney associated with Sullivan and Associates. The firm could be seized as an asset connected to criminal activities, and my father could face prosecution for money laundering even if he remained unaware of Danny's crimes. The irony was overwhelming. In his desperation to save himself from gambling debts, Danny had created legal problems that threatened to destroy everything our family had worked to build. The son who was supposed to inherit and protect the Sullivan legacy was actually orchestrating its complete destruction through his selfish and criminal behavior. Armed with comprehensive evidence of Danny's criminal activities, I scheduled an emergency meeting with my father for the following Monday morning. I spent the weekend organizing the documentation into a clear chronological presentation that would demonstrate the scope of the threat facing our family firm. Surely confronted with irrefutable proof of his son's crimes, William would have no choice but to reconsider his decision about the firm's succession. I arrived at Sullivan and Associates 30 minutes early, using the time to review my presentation one final time. The evidence was overwhelming: bank records showing systematic theft from client accounts, pawn shop receipts documenting the sale of family possessions, correspondence from regulatory authorities investigating suspicious financial transactions, and federal documents indicating Danny's involvement in money laundering investigations. My father's secretary, Margaret, had worked for the firm for over 20 years and had watched me grow up during countless childhood visits to the office. Her warm greeting that morning carried undertones of sympathy that suggested she was aware of the recent family tensions, though she remained professionally discreet about whatever conversations she might have overheard. William agreed to see me immediately, though his expression remained guarded as I settled into the chair across from his desk. The office felt different now, less like the familiar sanctuary where I had dreamed of working, and more like the territory of someone who had become my adversary rather than my advocate. "Dad, I have discovered information about Danny that you need to see immediately." I began spreading the first set of documents across his desk. He's been stealing money from client trust accounts to pay gambling debts, and his activities are exposing the firm to federal investigation. William glanced at the bank statements without really examining them, his expression suggesting he had already decided to dismiss whatever evidence I had brought. He pushed the papers back toward me with obvious irritation, as if I were wasting his time with trivial complaints about my brother. "Catherine, I thought we had resolved this matter last week. Your jealousy about Danny's appointment is understandable, but I will not tolerate false accusations designed to undermine his position. This kind of vindictive behavior is exactly why I concluded you were unsuitable for leadership responsibilities. His refusal to even examine the evidence was both infuriating and bewildering. I laid out additional documentation, including the pawn shop receipts and the letter from the Attorney Registration and Disciplinary Commission. Each piece of evidence told the same story. Danny was systematically looting the firm to fund his gambling addiction, while exposing everyone to serious legal consequences. These are not false accusations, I insisted, pointing to specific transactions that clearly showed unauthorized withdrawals from accounts Danny should not have been able to access. He forged signatures on these checks, and the amounts total more than $30,000 over the past 6 months. William stood and walked to his window, refusing to look at the documents I had carefully arranged on his desk. His body language communicated complete rejection of everything I was trying to tell him, as if the mere source of the information invalidated its credibility, regardless of its accuracy. "Your brother has explained these transactions to me already," he said, without turning around. He identified some inefficiencies in our accounting procedures and took initiative to streamline certain processes. "The apparent irregularities you have discovered are the result of legitimate business improvements rather than criminal activities." The response revealed that Danny had anticipated this confrontation and prepared his father with plausible explanations for the financial discrepancies. My brother had gotten ahead of my investigation by framing his theft as administrative improvements, counting on our father's trust and his prejudice against me to prevent serious scrutiny of the evidence. I tried a different approach, focusing on the federal investigation documents that would be impossible to explain away as routine business matters. The FBI letter explicitly identified Danny as a person of interest in a money laundering investigation connected to illegal gambling operations. No amount of spin could transform federal criminal investigation into legitimate business activity. "This is correspondence from the Federal Bureau of Investigation," I said, holding up the letter for his examination. "They are investigating Danny's connection to organized crime figures who use gambling operations to launder money. His activities are creating legal exposure for everyone associated with this firm." William finally turned from the window, but instead of examining the federal documents, he looked at me with an expression of profound disappointment. He returned to his desk and sat down, folding his hands with the air of someone preparing to deliver a lecture to a wayward child. "Catherine, I am deeply disturbed by the lengths you are willing to go to sabotage your brother's future. Manufacturing false federal documents is not only unethical, but potentially criminal. I am considering whether to report your actions to the Bar Association and request an investigation into your professional conduct." The accusation that I had forged federal documents was so outrageous that I could barely formulate a response. Everything I had presented was authentic evidence gathered through legitimate investigation, yet my father was choosing to believe that I had fabricated an entire criminal conspiracy, rather than acknowledge that his favored son was a thief and a criminal. At that moment, Danny arrived for what was clearly a prearranged meeting. He entered the office with confidence, greeted our father warmly, and settled into the chair next to mine as if he belonged there more than I did. His timing was too perfect to be coincidental. He'd been waiting for me to present my evidence so he could counter it immediately. "Catherine, I understand you are upset about not getting the position you wanted," Danny said with false sympathy, "but these wild accusations are really concerning. I think you might be having some kind of emotional breakdown from the stress of rejection." His performance was masterful. Danny positioned himself as the reasonable, concerned brother worried about his sister's mental health, while portraying my documented evidence as the delusional fantasies of someone unable to cope with professional disappointment. He had clearly rehearsed this response, anticipating exactly how I would approach our father with the truth about his crimes. The meeting deteriorated from there. William accepted every explanation Danny offered while dismissing every piece of evidence I presented. When I pointed to specific bank records showing forged signatures, Danny claimed he had been authorized to sign those documents during routine administrative tasks. When I mentioned the federal investigation, he suggested I had obtained fraudulent documents from internet sources to support my false accusations. By the end of the hour, my father had not only refused to examine the evidence, but had turned the entire confrontation into an indictment of my character and professional judgment. He ordered me to leave the office immediately and warned me never to contact him again unless I was prepared to apologize for my malicious attacks against my brother. As I gathered the ignored evidence from his desk, William delivered a final devastating blow. He walked to the fireplace in the corner of his office and fed several of my documents into the flames, watching them burn, while maintaining eye contact that communicated his complete rejection of everything I had tried to tell him. The symbolism was unmistakable. Not only was he refusing to believe the truth about Danny's crimes, but he was literally destroying evidence that could have protected the firm and our family from the legal consequences that were rapidly approaching. His loyalty to Danny was so complete that he preferred willful blindness to uncomfortable truths. The devastating failure of my confrontation with my father marked the beginning of the darkest period of my life. With my family turned against me and my professional prospects systematically destroyed, I found myself facing financial and emotional challenges that I had never imagined possible. The comfortable assumptions that had guided my life for 28 years had been shattered, leaving me to navigate an uncertain future without the support systems I had always taken for granted. I moved out of my childhood bedroom and into a studio apartment in Rogers Park, a neighborhood that offered affordable housing for someone with rapidly dwindling financial resources. The space was barely 400 square feet, with a Murphy bed that folded down from the wall and a kitchenette that consisted of a small refrigerator, 2-burner stove, and minimal counter space. The contrast with my previous living situation could not have been more stark. My parents' house in Lincoln Park featured 5 bedrooms, 3 full bathrooms, and elegant common areas that reflected decades of professional success. The transition from spacious comfort to cramped efficiency felt like a physical manifestation of how far my circumstances had fallen in just a few weeks. My savings account, which had contained $8,000 after law school graduation, dwindled rapidly as I paid security deposits, utility connections, and basic furnishings for my new life. The job search that I had expected to last a few weeks stretched into months, with each rejection adding to my growing financial stress and emotional despair. I took a part-time position at Grindhouse Coffee, a small shop near Northwestern University that catered to students and faculty. The work was honest but hardly utilized my legal education or professional training. I spent my days making lattes and serving pastries to customers who had no idea that their barista had graduated summa cum laude from law school and passed the Illinois bar examination with distinction. The irony was not lost on me that I was working in the service industry while my unqualified brother prepared to inherit a multi-million-dollar legal practice. Danny had never demonstrated the work ethic necessary to handle even entry-level employment, yet he would soon control attorneys, staff members, and client relationships that represented 3 generations of family achievement. My law school friends gradually stopped returning my phone calls, apparently warned away by rumors that portrayed me as unstable or professionally problematic. The legal community in Chicago was smaller and more interconnected than I had realized, and word of my rejection from the family firm had spread quickly through networks of attorneys, judges, and court personnel. The isolation was particularly painful because I had genuinely enjoyed the friendships I had developed during law school. Study groups, moot court competitions, and journal editorial meetings had created bonds that I expected would last throughout our careers. Instead, those relationships evaporated as my former classmates chose to distance themselves from someone whose professional reputation had been damaged by circumstances they did not fully understand. Even more devastating was the gradual realization that I was running out of money faster than I could find sustainable employment. The part-time coffee shop wages barely covered my rent and basic living expenses, leaving nothing for professional clothing, transportation costs, or the other expenses associated with job hunting in a competitive market. I applied for dozens of positions outside the legal profession, hoping to find work that would utilize my analytical skills and educational background. Corporate training programs, government agencies, and nonprofit organizations all seemed like reasonable alternatives to traditional law practice. But my applications disappeared into bureaucratic systems that never provided meaningful responses. The final blow came on a gray Tuesday morning in November when I found an eviction notice taped to my apartment door. Despite my careful budgeting and attempts to minimize expenses, I had fallen behind on rent by $600. The property management company was exercising their legal right to begin proceedings that would leave me homeless within 30 days. That evening, I sat on the floor of my tiny apartment surrounded by unpaid bills and rejection letters, contemplating the complete collapse of everything I had worked to achieve. My legal career had ended before it began. My family had abandoned me. My friends had disappeared, and my financial situation was approaching homelessness. The bar exam certificate that I had framed so proudly now seemed like a cruel joke hanging on the wall of an apartment I could no longer afford. All those years of academic excellence, all the sacrifices and dedication I had invested in preparing for a legal career had led to this moment of sitting on a bare floor, wondering where I would live next month. I considered abandoning law entirely and applying for teaching positions in suburban school districts. My undergraduate degree in political science would qualify me for social studies classrooms, and the work would provide steady income and benefits that could stabilize my immediate financial situation. The thought of giving up my legal aspirations felt like admitting defeat, but survival seemed more important than professional pride. But even as I contemplated this dramatic career change, a part of me remained convinced that the truth about Danny's criminal activities would eventually come to light. Federal investigations moved slowly but thoroughly, and his involvement with money laundering operations would inevitably be exposed regardless of my father's willingness to examine evidence. The question was whether I could survive financially and emotionally long enough to see justice served. Sitting in that empty apartment facing eviction and professional exile, I had no idea that forces were already in motion that would completely transform my situation within a matter of weeks. As I prepared for sleep on what might be one of my last nights in the apartment, my phone rang with a call from an unknown number. The timing seemed suspicious given that it was nearly 10 o'clock on a weeknight, but desperation made me willing to answer calls from sources I might normally have ignored. The voice on the other end would change everything, though I had no way of knowing that as I hesitantly said hello to someone whose identity and intentions remained completely mysterious. The woman on the phone spoke with the professional confidence of someone accustomed to handling sensitive information. Her voice carried a slight accent that I could not immediately place, and she chose her words carefully, as if she was working from prepared notes or following specific protocols for this type of contact. Miss Sullivan, my name is Sarah Martinez, and I am a forensic accountant working with federal authorities on a case that involves your brother, Daniel. I understand that you have been attempting to bring certain irregularities to the attention of your family, but those efforts have not been successful. I believe I can provide you with information that might help you understand the full scope of the situation. The call felt surreal after weeks of isolation and rejection. Here was someone who not only believed that Danny was involved in criminal activities, but possessed official authority to investigate those crimes. After months of having my concerns dismissed as jealous fantasies, I was finally speaking with someone who took the evidence seriously. Sarah suggested we meet in person to discuss details that were too sensitive for telephone conversations. She proposed a coffee shop in the Loop far enough from my neighborhood and my family's usual locations to ensure privacy. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday afternoon, giving me time to gather the evidence I had tried unsuccessfully to present to my father. I arrived at the designated location 30 minutes early, choosing a corner table where I could observe the entrance, while maintaining some privacy for our conversation. The coffee shop was busy enough to provide cover for sensitive discussions, but not so crowded that we would struggle to hear each other clearly. Sarah Martinez appeared precisely on time, and I recognized her immediately from her professional demeanor and the briefcase she carried. She was a woman in her early 40s, with short dark hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave her an academic appearance. Her clothing was conservative but expensive, suggesting someone who worked in high-level government or corporate environments. After brief introductions, Sarah spread several folders across our table, revealing documents that contained far more information about Danny's activities than I had been able to gather through my own investigation. Federal authorities had been monitoring his financial transactions for nearly 8 months, building a comprehensive case that connected his gambling debts to broader criminal enterprises. The illegal gambling operation, where your brother is a regular participant, serves multiple purposes, Sarah explained, pointing to surveillance photographs that showed Danny entering and leaving various locations. In addition to providing entertainment for gambling addicts, these operations launder money from drug trafficking, weapons sales, and other serious criminal activities. The federal investigation had identified Danny as what they termed a financial conduit, someone who used his access to legitimate business accounts to move illegal money through seemingly respectable channels. His position as heir to Sullivan and Associates made him particularly valuable to criminal organizations that needed ways to legitimize their profits. But the most shocking revelation concerned my father's unwitting involvement in the money laundering scheme. Sarah showed me bank records indicating that Sullivan and Associates had been receiving payments from shell companies controlled by organized crime figures. The money appeared to be legitimate legal fees, but it was actually laundered proceeds from illegal activities. Your father has been unknowingly signing documents that authorize these transactions. Sarah continued, showing me copies of paperwork that bore William's signature. Your brother has been presenting these as routine administrative matters while actually using the firm's accounts to process criminal money. The evidence was overwhelming and deeply disturbing. Not only had Danny been stealing from client accounts, but he had been using the family firm as an unwitting participant in federal crimes. His access to my father's signature and his knowledge of office procedures had allowed him to transform Sullivan and Associates into a tool for money laundering operations. Sarah offered me a deal that could provide both personal vindication and a path toward rebuilding my life. Federal authorities needed someone with insider knowledge of the firm's operations to help them gather additional evidence about the money laundering scheme. In exchange for my cooperation, they would provide immunity from prosecution and assistance in establishing my own legal practice once the investigation concluded. The proposal involved considerable personal risk. I would need to rebuild relationships with my family under false pretenses, pretending to accept my exclusion from the firm while actually gathering evidence about Danny's criminal activities. The work would require wearing recording devices during family interactions and documenting his access to sensitive financial information. Sarah was honest about the dangers involved. Danny's criminal associates were dangerous people who would not hesitate to use violence against anyone who threatened their operations. If my undercover work was discovered, I could face serious physical harm from people who viewed federal cooperation as a capital offense. But she also painted a picture of the potential benefits that extended beyond my personal situation. The investigation had already identified dozens of victims whose money had been stolen through various schemes connected to the gambling operation. Elderly clients of Sullivan and Associates were among those victims, their retirement savings and legal settlements diverted to fund criminal enterprises. Your cooperation could help us recover millions of dollars for people who have been victimized by these crimes, Sarah said, showing me files containing heartbreaking stories of financial exploitation. Many of these victims are elderly individuals who trusted your family's firm with their most important legal matters. The moral dimension of the choice was clear. I could walk away and focus on rebuilding my own life, leaving the investigation to proceed without my assistance. or I could accept the risks and help federal authorities expose criminal activities that were victimizing innocent people while destroying my family's legitimate business. As we prepared to conclude our meeting, Sarah revealed one final piece of information that made my decision inevitable. Danny had accelerated his criminal activities in recent weeks, apparently aware that federal scrutiny was increasing. He was systematically looting remaining client accounts and preparing to flee the country within a matter of weeks. If we do not act quickly, he will escape with several $100,000 in stolen money, and your father will face prosecution for crimes he does not even realize he has been committing. Your cooperation represents the only realistic chance to prevent both outcomes. The choice was both terrifying and obvious. I could continue my isolated struggle to survive financially while watching my family's reputation be destroyed by someone who viewed their legacy as nothing more than a source of ready cash. Or I could accept federal protection and work to expose criminal activities that threatened innocent victims as well as my own family. I agreed to cooperate with the investigation, understanding that this decision would put me in considerable danger, but also provide my only realistic chance of achieving justice for the crimes that had been committed against me and countless other victims. The next phase of my life required skills I had never developed, and emotional resilience I was not sure I possessed. Sarah Martinez provided me with sophisticated recording equipment disguised as everyday items, a pen that captured audio, a watch with video capabilities, and earrings that transmitted conversations to federal monitoring stations in real time. The technology was impressive but intimidating. One mistake with the equipment could expose my role in the federal investigation and place me in serious danger from criminals who viewed cooperation with authorities as an unforgivable betrayal. Sarah spent hours training me on proper usage and emergency protocols that might save my life if my cover was blown. The hardest part was preparing emotionally for the deception I would need to maintain with my family. Rebuilding relationships with people who had betrayed and abandoned me required swallowing my pride and pretending to accept their version of events. I had to convince them that I had come to terms with being excluded from the firm while actually working to expose the criminal activities that made their decision so tragically misguided. My first target was my mother, Patricia, whose emotional manipulation had been less obvious but equally destructive than my father's open rejection. I called her on a Wednesday evening, adopting a tone of resignation and defeat that would appeal to her belief that my legal career had been an unrealistic fantasy. "Mom, I have been doing a lot of thinking about our conversation last month, and I realize you were right about the challenges facing women in demanding legal careers. I want to apologize for the way I reacted to your concerns and Dad's decision about the firm." Patricia's response was immediately sympathetic, as I had expected. She invited me to dinner the following evening, eager to rebuild our relationship now that I appeared to have accepted her worldview about appropriate roles for women. The conversation would give me an opportunity to gather information about the family's current situation, while testing my ability to maintain deceptive relationships under federal surveillance. The dinner was emotionally grueling but informationally productive. Patricia revealed that Danny had been discussing plans to modernize the firm's operations, including transitioning to electronic financial management systems that would streamline client account administration. What she described as efficiency improvements were actually preparations for systematic looting of remaining assets. More disturbing was her revelation that Danny had been asking detailed questions about my whereabouts and activities. He seemed particularly interested in whether I had been in contact with former law school classmates or potential employers outside the Chicago area. His inquiries suggested paranoia about my activities that could indicate awareness of federal surveillance. I also learned that William had been experiencing health problems related to stress about the firm's financial situation. Several major clients had expressed concerns about account management irregularities, and the Illinois Attorney Registration and Disciplinary Commission had scheduled a formal review of Sullivan and Associates' compliance with trust account regulations. Patricia attributed these problems to temporary administrative challenges that Danny would resolve once he assumed full control of operations. She had no idea that the irregularities were actually evidence of systematic theft that had been ongoing for months. Her willingness to accept Danny's explanations without scrutiny revealed how completely he had manipulated the entire family's understanding of the situation. Over the following weeks, I gradually re-established contact with both my parents and Danny himself. Each interaction required careful preparation with Sarah Martinez, who coached me on conversation strategies that would elicit useful information without arousing suspicion about my motives. The most challenging meetings were direct conversations with Danny, who remained suspicious about my sudden change of attitude. He questioned my acceptance of the succession decision and probed for information about my current living situation and employment status. I had to convince him that I was genuinely defeated and focused on rebuilding my life outside the legal profession. During one particularly tense dinner at my parents' house, Danny tested my sincerity by offering to help me find employment at firms where he claimed to have professional connections. His offer was actually an attempt to monitor my job search activities and ensure that I did not find positions where I might gain access to information that could threaten his schemes. The recording equipment captured dozens of hours of conversations that documented Danny's knowledge of financial irregularities and his deliberate efforts to conceal the true nature of his activities. More importantly, the recording showed my father unknowingly authorizing transactions that facilitated money laundering operations. Sarah and her federal colleagues used this evidence to build detailed profiles of the criminal network that Danny had become entangled with through his gambling addiction. The investigation revealed connections to drug trafficking organizations, illegal weapons dealers, and human trafficking operations that used gambling establishments as fronts for more serious criminal enterprises. But the most personally devastating discovery came when Sarah showed me evidence that Danny had been stealing specifically from elderly divorce clients, whose cases involved significant financial settlements. These victims had trusted Sullivan and Associates with their most important legal matters, often involving the division of assets accumulated over decades of marriage. One case involved an 82-year-old woman named Margaret Chen, whose divorce settlement included her life savings of $120,000. Danny had forged her signature on documents redirecting the funds to accounts he controlled, leaving her financially destitute while she believed her money was safely held in trust by our family's firm. Another victim was Robert Washington, a 75-year-old man whose workers' compensation settlement of $90,000 had been stolen through similar methods. He had been calling the firm for weeks trying to understand why his settlement payments had stopped, while Danny provided false explanations about administrative delays and court processing requirements. The human cost of Danny's crimes was staggering. Dozens of elderly clients had been systematically robbed of money they needed for medical care, housing, and basic living expenses. Their trust in the Sullivan family name had been exploited by someone who viewed their vulnerability as an opportunity for personal enrichment. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Danny was accelerating his timeline for escaping the consequences of his actions. Sarah's surveillance team reported that he had been meeting with individuals known to specialize in creating false identities and arranging international travel for people fleeing legal problems. The evidence suggested that Danny planned to liquidate remaining client accounts and disappear within a matter of weeks, leaving behind a trail of financial devastation that would destroy both his victims and the family firm that had enabled his crimes through willful blindness to obvious warning signs. Over the following 2 months of careful surveillance and strategic family interactions, the scope of Danny's criminal enterprise became horrifyingly clear. Working closely with Sarah Martinez and her federal team, I documented a sophisticated operation that extended far beyond simple gambling debts into organized financial crimes that victimized dozens of innocent clients. The recording equipment captured conversations that revealed Danny's methodical approach to identifying vulnerable targets within Sullivan and Associates' client base. He specifically sought elderly divorce clients, workers' compensation recipients, and estate settlement beneficiaries whose cases involved substantial cash payments that could be diverted without immediate detection. His technique was devastatingly simple, yet effective. Danny would intercept settlement checks before they reached clients, forging signatures and depositing the funds into accounts he controlled through shell companies. He then provided false explanations to clients about delays in processing their payments, buying time while he used their money to pay gambling debts and personal expenses. One particularly disturbing recording captured Danny explaining his selection criteria to an unknown associate during what appeared to be a planning session for future thefts. He described elderly clients as ideal targets because they were less likely to understand complex financial procedures and more trusting of professional authority figures. The old ones never question anything as long as you sound official and give them paperwork to sign, Danny said during a conversation recorded at a restaurant near the firm's offices. They grew up respecting lawyers and assuming we have their best interests at heart. It makes them perfect marks for this kind of operation. Sarah's forensic accounting revealed that Danny had successfully stolen money from 17 different clients over the past 8 months, with total losses exceeding $230,000. Each theft followed the same pattern: intercepted settlement funds, forged signatures, false explanations, and systematic cover-ups that exploited clients' trust in the Sullivan family reputation. But the investigation also uncovered evidence that Danny's crimes extended beyond simple theft into more serious federal offenses. Bank records showed that he had been laundering stolen money through the same gambling operations that had initially gotten him into financial trouble, creating a cycle where criminal profits were used to pay debts to other criminal enterprises. The money laundering scheme involved complex transactions that moved stolen funds through multiple accounts before they reached their final destinations. Danny had established relationships with individuals who specialized in financial crimes, learning sophisticated techniques that allowed him to process large amounts of money while avoiding automatic reporting requirements that might trigger regulatory scrutiny. Federal surveillance documented meetings between Danny and known associates of organized crime families that controlled much of Chicago's illegal gambling industry. These individuals provided him with technical expertise and financial infrastructure in exchange for access to legitimate business accounts that could be used to launder money from drug trafficking and other serious criminal activities. The scope of the criminal network was staggering. Danny's gambling debts had been deliberately cultivated by criminal organizations that specialized in recruiting vulnerable individuals who could provide access to legitimate financial institutions. His desperation had made him an ideal candidate for recruitment into money laundering operations that required insider access to law firm accounts. Sarah showed me surveillance footage that captured Danny delivering cash payments to individuals whose criminal backgrounds included convictions for racketeering, extortion, and violent crimes connected to organized gambling operations. These meetings typically occurred in parking garages or other locations chosen specifically to avoid law enforcement surveillance. The federal investigation had identified at least 4 other law firms in the Chicago area where similar recruitment and exploitation had occurred. Criminal organizations had developed systematic approaches to identifying attorneys and legal staff whose financial desperation or substance abuse problems made them vulnerable to coercion and manipulation. But perhaps the most devastating evidence concerned my father's unwitting participation in facilitating these crimes. Recording equipment captured conversations where Danny convinced William to sign documents that authorized transactions he did not fully understand, exploiting his father's trust and his declining attention to administrative details. One particularly damaging recording showed Danny presenting William with a stack of authorization forms during a busy afternoon when multiple client emergencies demanded immediate attention. William signed the documents without careful review, trusting that his son was handling routine administrative matters competently and honestly. Those signatures authorized the transfer of over $50,000 from client trust accounts to shell companies controlled by criminal associates. William had unknowingly become an accessory to money laundering operations that funded drug trafficking and other serious criminal enterprises throughout the Midwest region. The evidence also revealed that several clients had attempted to file complaints about missing funds with the Illinois Attorney Registration and Disciplinary Commission, but those complaints had been systematically buried through bribery and intimidation. Danny had paid court clerks and administrative staff to lose paperwork and delay investigations that might expose his criminal activities. 3 elderly clients had been threatened with legal action if they continued pursuing complaints about missing settlement funds. Danny used his knowledge of legal procedures to intimidate victims, convincing them that questioning the firm's handling of their cases could result in expensive litigation that would consume whatever money they hoped to recover. The psychological manipulation was as sophisticated as the financial crimes. Danny exploited his victims' trust in professional authority while using their fear of legal complexity to discourage them from seeking help from other attorneys or law enforcement agencies. Many victims remained convinced that their missing money would eventually be returned through normal administrative processes. But Sarah's investigation had also identified a crucial vulnerability in Danny's operation. Federal banking regulations required automatic reporting of certain types of transactions, and his money laundering activities had triggered multiple suspicious activity reports that created a paper trail connecting him to known criminal enterprises. Moreover, his acceleration of theft activities had created accounting discrepancies that were becoming impossible to explain away as administrative errors. The Illinois Attorney Registration and Disciplinary Commission was preparing a formal audit of Sullivan and Associates that would certainly expose the missing client funds within a matter of weeks. Danny appeared to be aware that his time was running out. Surveillance teams reported that he had been liquidating personal assets and making arrangements that suggested preparation for immediate departure from Chicago. Federal agents had identified travel reservations and financial transfers that indicated he planned to flee the country before the end of the month. The urgency of the situation was compounded by evidence that Danny had been making threats against potential witnesses who might cooperate with law enforcement investigations. Sarah warned me that my safety could be compromised if he discovered my role in gathering evidence about his criminal activities. As we prepared for the final phase of the investigation, Sarah revealed that federal authorities were ready to make arrests, but needed one crucial piece of evidence to ensure successful prosecution. They required documentation that clearly demonstrated Danny's knowledge that his activities constituted criminal money laundering rather than simply unauthorized use of client funds. The distinction was legally significant because money laundering charges carried much longer prison sentences and allowed prosecutors to seize assets connected to criminal enterprises. Without clear evidence of intent to launder money, Danny might face only embezzlement charges that would result in shorter prison terms and limited asset forfeiture. Sarah proposed that I attempt to record a conversation where Danny explicitly acknowledged his involvement in money laundering operations. The evidence would require careful orchestration to ensure that he revealed incriminating information, while federal agents could monitor the interaction and provide immediate assistance if the situation became dangerous. But she also warned me that this final operation would be the most risky aspect of my cooperation with the federal investigation. Danny had become increasingly paranoid about potential surveillance, and any mistake could expose my role in building the case against him. As I prepared for what might be my final undercover interaction with my brother, I reflected on how completely his criminal activities had corrupted everything our family had worked to build over 3 generations. The Sullivan name had once represented integrity and competent legal representation, but Danny had transformed it into a tool for victimizing the very people who trusted our family with their most important legal matters. The call from Sarah Martinez came at 6:15 on a Thursday morning, jolting me awake with news that changed everything about our carefully planned investigation timeline. Federal surveillance teams had observed Danny loading suitcases into his car and making cash withdrawals from multiple ATM locations throughout the previous evening. All indicators suggested he planned to flee Chicago within hours rather than weeks. "We need to move immediately," Sarah said, her voice carrying the urgent tension of someone coordinating a law enforcement operation under extreme time pressure. "Our surveillance team lost him around midnight, and we believe he may be attempting to leave the country before we can execute arrest warrants." The accelerated timeline meant that our plan to gather additional evidence through recorded conversations was no longer feasible. Federal agents needed to arrest Danny immediately based on the evidence we had already collected, or risk losing him entirely to international flight that would complicate prosecution efforts for years. I dressed quickly and met Sarah at a federal building downtown where she briefed me on the developing situation, while agents prepared to execute search warrants at multiple locations connected to Danny's criminal network. The coordinated operation would target not only Danny himself, but also his criminal associates and the financial infrastructure that had enabled his money laundering activities. The command center buzzed with activity as federal agents, forensic accountants, and prosecutors coordinated simultaneous raids designed to prevent Danny and his associates from destroying evidence or fleeing to jurisdictions where extradition would be difficult or impossible. Large monitors displayed maps showing the locations of various targets and real-time updates from surveillance teams positioned throughout the Chicago area. But as the morning progressed, it became clear that Danny had anticipated law enforcement action and implemented escape plans that demonstrated sophisticated criminal planning. Federal agents arrived at his apartment to find it completely empty, except for a handwritten note that had been deliberately left where investigators would find it immediately. The note was addressed to me, specifically indicating that Danny had discovered my cooperation with federal authorities, despite all our precautions to maintain secrecy. His message contained explicit threats against both me and our parents, along with demands that revealed his desperation and complete lack of remorse for the crimes he had committed. "Catherine, I know you have been working with federal agents to build a case against me. You have chosen to betray your own family for people who will discard you as soon as this investigation concludes. Your cooperation will not save our father from prosecution or protect the firm from complete destruction." The note continued with detailed threats that demonstrated Danny's awareness of my daily routines and living situation. He had been monitoring my activities while I thought I was secretly gathering evidence about his criminal behavior. The realization that he had been watching me for weeks was both terrifying and infuriating. More disturbing were his threats against our parents, who remained completely unaware of the federal investigation or the extent of Danny's criminal activities. He claimed that he would ensure William faced prosecution for money laundering unless I helped facilitate his escape from federal custody. "I have evidence that will make Dad appear to be the mastermind behind the entire money laundering operation," the note continued. "Financial records and forged documents will convince prosecutors that he directed my activities while pretending to be an innocent victim of my crimes." Sarah and her colleagues took these threats seriously, immediately implementing protective measures for both me and my parents, while federal agents expanded their search to include locations where Danny might be hiding. The investigation had evolved from a complex white-collar crime case into an urgent manhunt with potential violence against witnesses and family members. The forensic accounting team reported that Danny had liquidated client accounts containing nearly $200,000 during his final weeks in Chicago. Multiple elderly clients would soon discover that their life savings and legal settlements had been stolen by someone they trusted with their most important financial matters. One particularly heartbreaking case involved an elderly woman named Dorothy Stevens, whose divorce settlement of $85,000 represented her only financial resources after a 40-year marriage ended. Danny had forged her signature just 3 days earlier, stealing money she needed for housing and medical care during her final years. Federal agents also discovered that Danny had been systematically destroying evidence of his criminal activities, including computer files that contained records of money laundering transactions and correspondence with his criminal associates. His preparation for flight had included careful attention to eliminating traces of his involvement in organized crime operations. The search expanded to include airports, train stations, and border crossings where Danny might attempt to leave the United States. Federal agents coordinated with international law enforcement agencies to monitor flights to countries that had limited extradition agreements with the United States. But the most urgent concern was the possibility that Danny would attempt to harm family members or witnesses before federal agents could locate and arrest him. His note indicated knowledge of my cooperation and suggested willingness to use violence against people he viewed as threats to his escape plans. Sarah arranged for federal protection while agents continued their search, but she warned me that Danny's criminal associates included individuals with extensive experience in evading law enforcement surveillance. The gambling operations that had initially ensnared him were controlled by organized crime figures who maintained sophisticated networks designed to help valuable assets disappear when legal pressure became too intense. As the day progressed without any sign of Danny's whereabouts, federal investigators began examining his known associates and their potential hiding places. The surveillance had identified safe houses and meeting locations used by his criminal network, but searches of these sites revealed that multiple individuals connected to the money laundering operation had also disappeared. The coordinated nature of the disappearances suggested that Danny's criminal associates had implemented previously arranged plans to protect their operations from law enforcement scrutiny. Federal agents were dealing with an organized criminal enterprise rather than a single desperate individual attempting to avoid prosecution. Late that afternoon, Sarah received a phone call that changed the entire dynamic of our situation. Danny had contacted my father's office demanding to speak with me directly and threatening immediate harm to our parents if I did not agree to meet with him at a location of his choosing. He is claiming that he has evidence that will destroy Dad's reputation and send him to federal prison for decades, Sarah reported after the call ended. He wants to arrange an exchange where you help facilitate his escape in return for protecting your family from prosecution. The proposal was obviously a trap designed to eliminate me as a witness while giving Danny additional leverage over federal prosecutors. But it also represented our best opportunity to locate him before he could successfully flee the country or carry out his threats against innocent family members. Federal agents proposed using me as bait in a carefully controlled operation designed to draw Danny into a situation where he could be arrested safely. The plan involved considerable personal risk, but it offered the only realistic chance of ending the crisis before additional people were victimized by his criminal desperation. As we prepared for what would likely be the final confrontation with my brother, I reflected on how completely his choices had corrupted everything our family represented. The Sullivan name had once stood for integrity and professional excellence, but Danny's crimes had transformed our legacy into a cautionary tale about greed and moral corruption. Danny chose Northside Park for our meeting, a location that held significant childhood memories for both of us. The irony was not lost on me that he had selected the place where we had played together as innocent children for what would likely be our final confrontation as adults whose choices had led them down completely different moral paths. The park was largely deserted on a cold Wednesday afternoon in late November. Bare trees and brown grass created a desolate landscape that matched the emotional weight of the situation I was walking into. Federal agents had positioned themselves throughout the area, but their presence would need to remain completely hidden to avoid triggering whatever escape plan Danny had prepared. I wore the most sophisticated recording equipment Sarah's team possessed, designed to capture high-quality audio even in outdoor environments with significant background noise. The devices were integrated into my clothing and jewelry in ways that would be invisible during casual inspection, but Danny's paranoia about surveillance made discovery a constant risk. Sarah and her team maintained radio contact through an earpiece disguised as a hearing aid, allowing them to monitor the conversation in real time and coordinate immediate response if the situation became dangerous. Federal agents were prepared to intervene within seconds if Danny attempted violence or if his behavior suggested imminent flight. Danny appeared at exactly 3 o'clock, approaching from the opposite side of the park with obvious caution about potential surveillance. He wore dark clothing and sunglasses despite the overcast weather, and his body language communicated extreme nervousness about being observed or followed. He had lost significant weight since our last meeting, and his appearance suggested someone under enormous stress from both criminal pressure and substance abuse. The confident smugness that had characterized his earlier interactions with our family had been replaced by desperation and paranoia that made him genuinely dangerous. Catherine, I know you are wearing recording devices and that federal agents are watching this meeting. He began without any pretense of normal family conversation. I need you to understand that I have prepared evidence that will destroy Dad's life if you do not help me get out of this situation. His opening statement was both an acknowledgement of my cooperation with federal authorities and an attempt to establish leverage that might convince me to facilitate his escape. But it also provided the explicit confession that Sarah's team needed to document his awareness of criminal wrongdoing rather than simple administrative errors. I maintained the pretense of being a concerned sister while encouraging him to explain his demands and threats in detail. The recording equipment needed to capture clear statements about his criminal activities and his plans for avoiding prosecution through flight or intimidation of witnesses. You have always been the smart one in this family. Danny continued pacing nervously while scanning the park for signs of federal surveillance. But you do not understand how deep this goes or how many people will be destroyed when the federal prosecution begins. I can protect Dad, but only if you help me disappear before they arrest me. His proposed deal involved me providing false testimony that would portray him as a victim of organized crime coercion rather than a willing participant in money laundering operations. In exchange, he claimed he would surrender documents that would exonerate our father from any criminal liability for unwittingly facilitating financial crimes. But as the conversation continued, Danny revealed the true extent of his preparation for this confrontation. He'd spent weeks creating forged documents that portrayed me as the mastermind behind the entire criminal operation, with himself as merely someone following my instructions under threat of family financial ruin. I have bank records showing that you authorized all the major transactions and correspondence that makes it look like you were directing my activities from the beginning. He explained with obvious satisfaction at his own deviousness. Federal prosecutors will believe that you manipulated a desperate younger brother into helping you steal client money to fund your own gambling addiction. The sophisticated nature of his frame-up attempt revealed criminal planning that extended far beyond the gambling debts that had initially motivated his theft from client accounts. Danny had been preparing for this confrontation for months, crafting evidence designed to shift blame onto me while positioning himself as a victim of family manipulation. More disturbing was his revelation that he had been gathering personal information about my cooperation with federal authorities, apparently through criminal associates who had access to law enforcement intelligence. His knowledge of details about the federal investigation suggested corruption within agencies that were supposed to be investigating his crimes. Your federal friends are not as trustworthy as you believe, Danny said with a smile that was genuinely chilling. I know exactly what evidence they have collected and how they plan to use your testimony. But I also know things about their investigation that would surprise you if you understood who was really providing them with information. His comments suggested that criminal organizations had infiltrated federal law enforcement agencies investigating organized gambling and money laundering operations. The possibility that Sarah Martinez or her colleagues were compromised added another layer of danger to an already volatile situation. But Danny's most devastating threat concerned our parents, who remained completely unaware of either his criminal activities or my cooperation with federal authorities. He claimed to have prepared evidence that would ensure William faced serious federal charges regardless of his actual knowledge of money laundering operations. Dad will spend his final years in federal prison unless you convince prosecutors that I was acting under your direction, Danny stated with cold determination. I've created a paper trail that makes him look like the leader of the entire operation, with both of us following his orders to steal client money and launder it through organized crime networks. As federal agents monitored our conversation through surveillance equipment, Danny's threats became increasingly specific and violent. He described detailed plans for harming family members if I continued cooperating with law enforcement, and his knowledge of my daily routines suggested he had been stalking me for weeks. But his desperation also led him to reveal crucial information about his criminal associates and their operations throughout the Chicago area. The recording equipment captured names, locations, and financial details that would allow federal prosecutors to expand their investigation into broader organized crime networks. The conversation reached its climax when Danny demanded that I immediately contact Sarah Martinez and arrange for federal agents to allow his safe passage to a private airport where a plane was waiting to transport him to a country without extradition agreements. His ultimatum gave me exactly 1 hour to comply before he would implement threats against our parents and other potential witnesses. You have 60 minutes to prove that family loyalty means more to you than cooperation with federal agents who will abandon you as soon as this case ends, he said, checking his watch with theatrical precision. After that, Dad becomes the primary target of a federal prosecution that will destroy everything our family has worked to build for 3 generations. But as Danny prepared to leave the park confident that his threats had given him control over the situation, he made a crucial mistake that would seal his fate. In his eagerness to demonstrate the power he held over our family's future, he admitted to crimes that went far beyond anything federal authorities had suspected. I've been planning this operation for over 2 years, he boasted, apparently believing that intimidation required revealing the full scope of his criminal sophistication. The gambling debts were just the beginning. I identified weaknesses in law firm financial systems and developed relationships with criminal organizations that could help me exploit those vulnerabilities systematically. His confession revealed that Danny's crimes were not the result of desperate attempts to pay gambling debts, but rather a carefully planned criminal enterprise designed to exploit elder law clients and their trust in professional authority. The recording equipment captured admissions that would support federal charges carrying potential life sentences, rather than the shorter prison terms associated with simple embezzlement. As Danny walked away from our confrontation convinced that he had established control over the situation through threats and intimidation, federal agents closed in from multiple directions. His arrest was swift and decisive, ending months of criminal activity that had victimized dozens of innocent people while corrupting the family business that represented 3 generations of honest legal work. But even as federal agents placed him in custody, Danny attempted one final act of violence that demonstrated his complete lack of remorse for the destruction he had caused. His attack on me was prevented only by the immediate intervention of agents who had been monitoring our conversation and were prepared for exactly this type of desperate response. Danny's arrest on federal charges of money laundering, elder abuse, and conspiracy sent shockwaves through Chicago's legal community and our family's personal world. The carefully constructed facade of family unity and professional respectability crumbled within hours as news of his crimes spread throughout the networks of attorneys, judges, and court personnel who had known the Sullivan name for 3 generations. Federal prosecutors filed a comprehensive indictment that detailed 27 separate criminal counts, each carrying potential prison sentences that could result in Danny spending the remainder of his life in federal custody. The charges ranged from simple theft of client funds to sophisticated money laundering operations that had facilitated drug trafficking and other serious criminal enterprises throughout the Midwest region. The evidence I had helped federal authorities gather proved decisive in building an airtight case that left no room for plea negotiations or reduced sentences. Danny's recorded confessions combined with forensic accounting that documented every stolen transaction created a prosecution case that legal experts described as virtually impossible to defend successfully. But the immediate impact on our family was devastating in ways that extended far beyond Danny's criminal liability. Within days of his arrest, 36 former clients of Sullivan and Associates filed civil lawsuits seeking recovery of money that had been stolen from trust accounts and settlement funds. The combined claims exceeded $800,000, far more than the firm's insurance policies could cover. The Illinois Attorney Registration and Disciplinary Commission launched formal proceedings that threatened to suspend Williams' license to practice law, effectively ending his career and closing the firm that had employed 15 attorneys and support staff. Even though federal prosecutors acknowledged that he had been an unwitting victim of Danny's manipulation, professional responsibility rules held him accountable for failing to properly supervise trust account management. More personally devastating was watching my father confront the full extent of his son's betrayal and his own failure to recognize obvious warning signs. William aged visibly during the weeks following Danny's arrest as the reality of what had happened destroyed his faith in his own judgment and professional competence. I found him in his office one evening sitting alone among boxes of client files that would need to be transferred to other attorneys as Sullivan and Associates prepared to close permanently. The man who had once commanded respect throughout Chicago's legal community looked broken and defeated, struggling to understand how everything he had worked to build could be destroyed by someone he had trusted completely. "Catherine, I owe you an apology that no words can adequately express," he said when he noticed me in the doorway. "You tried to warn me about Danny's criminal activities, and I not only refused to listen, but actively worked to prevent you from practicing law anywhere in Chicago. My prejudice and blind loyalty have destroyed everything our family represented." His acknowledgement of the gender bias that had influenced his decisions was both gratifying and heartbreaking. The man who had once told colleagues that I would carry on the family tradition had ultimately rejected me because deep-seated assumptions about women's capabilities had overridden his knowledge of my actual qualifications and character. But even more painful was learning about the specific victims whose trust in the Sullivan family name had been exploited by Danny's criminal greed. Federal investigators shared details about elderly clients whose life savings had been stolen while they believed their money was safely held in trust by attorneys who cared about their welfare. Margaret Chen, the 82-year-old woman whose divorce settlement had been stolen, had been forced to move in with relatives after losing her financial independence. Robert Washington, the workers' compensation recipient, had been unable to afford necessary medical treatments while believing administrative delays were preventing access to his settlement money. Each victim's story represented not just financial loss, but betrayal of the fundamental trust that clients place in their attorneys. These were vulnerable people who had relied on the Sullivan family reputation during some of the most difficult periods of their lives, only to discover that their trust had been exploited for personal enrichment by someone who viewed their vulnerability as an opportunity. The civil lawsuits filed against Sullivan and Associates would eventually be resolved through a combination of malpractice insurance personal assets and a victim compensation fund established through federal asset forfeiture proceedings. But the financial recovery could never fully restore the security and dignity that Danny's crimes had stolen from people who deserved protection rather than exploitation. The broader impact on Chicago's legal community was equally significant. The scandal prompted regulatory reviews of trust account management procedures at other firms and legislative discussions about enhanced supervision requirements designed to prevent similar crimes. The Sullivan family name, which had once represented professional excellence, became a cautionary tale about the importance of proper oversight and accountability in legal practice. Media coverage of Danny's crimes and federal prosecution created additional challenges for our family's recovery efforts. Television news reports and newspaper articles detailed the money laundering scheme and its impact on elderly victims, ensuring that the Sullivan name would be associated with criminal activity for years to come. But perhaps the most devastating revelation came when federal prosecutors revealed the full scope of Danny's manipulation of our father's trust and professional judgment. Evidence showed that Danny had been systematically exploiting William's declining attention to administrative details while using his position as heir apparent to gain access to sensitive financial information. The recordings I had gathered demonstrated how skillfully Danny had presented criminal money laundering transactions as routine administrative improvements, exploiting his father's busy schedule and natural inclination to delegate operational details to someone he trusted completely. William had unknowingly become an accessory to serious federal crimes while believing he was supporting his son's legitimate efforts to modernize firm operations. As the legal proceedings against Danny moved forward, federal prosecutors offered William immunity from criminal prosecution in exchange for his cooperation in building cases against the organized crime figures who had controlled the money laundering network. His willingness to testify against dangerous criminals required considerable courage, but it also provided his only realistic path toward avoiding federal charges that could result in decades in prison. The immunity agreement also required William to surrender his law license voluntarily and accept permanent disbarment from legal practice. The career that had defined his identity and provided purpose for his life would end in professional disgrace, even though he had been more victim than perpetrator of the crimes that had destroyed his firm. In a gesture that came too late to repair the damage he had caused, but demonstrated genuine remorse for his treatment of me, William approached me with an offer to transfer ownership of Sullivan and Associates entirely into my name. The firm would face immediate closure due to pending litigation and regulatory sanctions, but its assets and client relationships could potentially be salvaged under new management that was not associated with the criminal scandal. Catherine, I know this offer cannot undo the harm I have caused or restore the opportunities I destroyed through my prejudice and poor judgment, he said during our final conversation in the office, where I had once dreamed of practicing law alongside him. But if there is any way for you to rebuild something positive from the wreckage of our family's legacy, you have my complete support and blessing. His offer was generous but impractical given the legal and financial challenges facing the firm. More importantly, I had already begun building a different kind of legal practice that would allow me to help victims of financial crimes rather than simply representing traditional family law matters. The path forward lay not in inheriting the damaged remnants of our family's practice, but in creating something entirely new that reflected my own values and professional goals. The months following Danny's arrest brought vindication that exceeded anything I could have imagined during those dark weeks when I had faced eviction and professional exile. Federal authorities not only publicly acknowledged my crucial role in exposing the money laundering operation, but recommended me for special recognition from the Illinois State Bar Association for my courage in protecting elderly clients from ongoing financial exploitation. Sarah Martinez helped me establish Catherine Sullivan Legal Services, a practice specializing in elder law and financial fraud prevention that attracted clients who had been victimized by similar schemes throughout the Chicago area. My cooperation with federal authorities had given me unique expertise in identifying and combating financial crimes that targeted vulnerable populations, creating a niche practice that served both important social purposes and my own professional goals. The first major case involved representing 12 elderly clients whose retirement savings had been stolen by an estate planning attorney who had used techniques similar to Danny's methods. My testimony about money laundering indicators and trust account manipulation proved crucial in securing criminal convictions and civil judgments that recovered over $600,000 for victims who had thought their money was permanently lost. More significantly, the Federal Bureau of Investigation awarded me a contract to provide training seminars for law enforcement agencies throughout the Midwest region on financial crimes targeting elderly victims. The work involved traveling to police departments, prosecutors' offices, and regulatory agencies to share knowledge I had gained through my undercover investigation of Danny's criminal network. The training programs were deeply satisfying because they allowed me to transform my family's tragedy into a tool for protecting other potential victims. Each seminar reached dozens of law enforcement professionals who would be better equipped to recognize and investigate similar crimes in their own jurisdictions, potentially preventing thousands of elderly people from losing their life savings to criminals who exploited professional trust. My practice grew rapidly as word spread about my expertise in financial fraud cases and my commitment to representing victims rather than perpetrators. Within 6 months, I had hired 2 associate attorneys and 3 support staff members, creating employment opportunities while building a firm that reflected my own values about professional responsibility and client advocacy. The irony was not lost on me that my new practice was becoming more successful than Sullivan & Associates had been at its peak. Free from the constraints of traditional family law practice and motivated by genuine passion for protecting vulnerable clients, I found that I could build a more meaningful and profitable legal career than would have been possible if I had simply inherited my father's firm. Legal publications throughout the state featured my story as an example of professional integrity, triumphing over family loyalty and personal financial pressure. The Illinois State Bar Journal published a detailed article about my role in the federal investigation, praising my decision to cooperate with authorities despite significant personal risks and family conflicts. More personally satisfying were the thank you letters I received from elderly clients whose money had been recovered through criminal prosecutions and civil judgments. Many of these individuals had given up hope of ever seeing their stolen savings again, and my work had not only restored their financial security, but validated their faith in the legal profession, despite their victimization by corrupt attorneys. One particularly moving letter came from Dorothy Stevens, the elderly woman whose divorce settlement Danny had stolen during his final weeks of criminal activity. Federal asset forfeiture proceedings had recovered her complete settlement amount, and she credited my investigation with saving her from poverty during her remaining years. Your courage in exposing these crimes gave me back my independence and dignity, she wrote in carefully formed handwriting that reflected her advanced age. I had lost faith that anyone in the legal profession cared about protecting people like me, but your actions proved that there are still attorneys who put their clients' welfare above personal gain. The broader impact of my work extended beyond individual client representation to systemic changes in how financial crimes against elderly victims were investigated and prosecuted. My recommendations influenced new regulatory requirements for trust account management and continuing education programs that helped attorneys recognize signs of financial exploitation in their own practices. I also testified before legislative committees considering enhanced penalties for financial crimes, targeting elderly victims, sharing insights gained through my investigation of Danny's methods and their devastating impact on vulnerable populations. The resulting legislation increased criminal penalties and expanded civil remedies available to victims of financial abuse by professionals in positions of trust. Professional recognition culminated in my selection to receive the Illinois State Bar Association's Award for Excellence in Public Service, honoring attorneys who make exceptional contributions to protecting vulnerable populations and advancing justice. The ceremony took place at the same downtown hotel where I had once attended Bar Association events as my father's guest, dreaming of someday receiving professional recognition for my own achievements. William and Patricia attended the awards ceremony both to show support for my success and to publicly acknowledge their regret about their earlier treatment of my career aspirations. Seeing them in the audience as I accepted recognition for accomplishments they had once tried to prevent added emotional complexity to what should have been an unambiguously happy occasion. My acceptance speech focused on the importance of legal professionals taking responsibility for protecting clients from exploitation rather than simply pursuing personal financial success. I spoke about the elderly victims whose trust had been betrayed by criminal attorneys and the obligation all legal professionals shared to identify and report suspicious activities that might indicate financial abuse. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from former clients whose cases had been resolved successfully through my work. Several elderly individuals attended the ceremony specifically to show their appreciation for my representation, and their presence reminded me why I had chosen to specialize in protecting vulnerable populations rather than pursuing more traditionally prestigious practice areas. The contrast between my current success and the professional exile I had faced just 18 months earlier was staggering. I had gone from being rejected by my own family and blacklisted throughout Chicago's legal community to receiving statewide recognition for professional excellence and public service. The vindication was both personally gratifying and professionally meaningful. More importantly, my work was making a genuine difference in protecting elderly people from financial exploitation, while building a sustainable practice that provided good employment for other attorneys and staff members. The firm's success proved that legal practices could be both profitable and socially responsible, serving important public purposes while maintaining high professional standards. As I reflected on the journey that had brought me from that devastating conversation in my father's office to this moment of professional triumph, I realized that being rejected from the family firm had ultimately led me to a more fulfilling career than I could have achieved through traditional inheritance of established practice. The forced independence had allowed me to discover my own values and build something meaningful rather than simply maintaining someone else's legacy. The success of my practice also attracted attention from larger law firms seeking to establish their own elder law and financial fraud departments. Several prestigious firms offered partnership positions that would have provided higher income and greater professional prestige than my independent practice could offer. But I declined these opportunities because I had learned that professional satisfaction came from meaningful work rather than traditional markers of success. Building my own firm allowed me to maintain control over client selection, case strategy, and office culture in ways that would not be possible as an employee of larger organizations focused primarily on profitability. 6 months after receiving the Illinois State Bar Association's Award for Excellence in Public Service, I stood before a packed courtroom as federal judge Patricia Morrison delivered Danny's sentence for his money laundering and elder abuse convictions. The proceedings marked the formal conclusion of a legal process that had fundamentally transformed not only my own life, but the lives of everyone connected to the Sullivan family legacy. Danny received 22 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, a sentence that reflected both the severity of his crimes and the vulnerability of his elderly victims. Federal asset forfeiture proceedings recovered nearly $400,000 that was distributed among the clients whose money he had stolen, providing some measure of financial justice for people who had thought their savings were permanently lost. Judge Morrison's comments during sentencing focused on the betrayal of professional trust that made Danny's crimes particularly heinous. She noted that attorneys occupy positions of special responsibility in society, and that exploiting that trust for personal gain undermines the entire legal system's credibility with vulnerable populations who depend on professional integrity. The defendant systematically exploited elderly clients who trusted him with their most important financial matters during vulnerable periods of their lives, Judge Morrison stated as Danny stood to receive his sentence. His crimes represent not just theft, but a profound violation of the professional obligations that make legal practice possible in a civilized society. William and Patricia attended the sentencing, both to show respect for Danny's victims and to demonstrate their support for the justice that had finally been achieved. Seeing them in the courtroom gallery, aged by stress and grief, but determined to witness accountability for crimes they had failed to prevent added emotional weight to what was already a profoundly moving experience. After the hearing concluded, I met with several of Danny's victims who had attended the sentencing to see justice delivered for the crimes that had stolen their financial security. Their expressions of gratitude for my role in exposing the money laundering operation were deeply moving, but they also reminded me of the ongoing responsibility I carried to continue protecting vulnerable people from similar exploitation. Margaret Chen, whose divorce settlement had been stolen, approached me with tears in her eyes and a handwritten card expressing gratitude for my work in recovering her money. At 83 years old, she had thought she would spend her remaining years dependent on relatives for basic living expenses, but the asset forfeiture recovery had restored her independence and dignity. "You gave me back my life when I thought everything was lost," she said with obvious emotion. "Your courage in standing up to your own family showed me that there are still people in this world who care more about doing right than protecting themselves." Her words captured something essential about the journey that had brought me to this moment. Being forced out of my family's firm and facing professional exile had initially felt like the destruction of everything I had worked to achieve, but that apparent catastrophe had actually opened pathways to more meaningful work and greater personal satisfaction than traditional inheritance of an established practice could have provided. Catherine Sullivan Legal Services now employed 8 attorneys and 12 support staff members, making it one of the largest elder law practices in Illinois. Our client base included individuals from throughout the Midwest region who'd been victimized by financial fraud or needed protection from exploitation by professionals in positions of trust. The practice had also expanded into consulting work with regulatory agencies and law enforcement organizations, seeking to improve their responses to financial crimes targeting elderly populations. My expertise in investigating money laundering operations had become a valuable resource for prosecutors throughout the region, building cases against corrupt attorneys and other professionals who exploited vulnerable clients. More personally rewarding was the mentoring program I had established to help other attorneys develop expertise in elder law and financial fraud prevention. Young lawyers who shared my commitment to protecting vulnerable populations could gain specialized training while contributing to important social purposes that extended beyond simple profit generation. The program had already trained 15 attorneys who went on to establish their own elder law practices or join firms specializing in financial abuse cases. Each new practitioner multiplied the impact of my work by bringing additional expertise and advocacy to communities where elderly people needed protection from financial exploitation. My success had also attracted national attention from organizations dedicated to combating financial abuse of elderly populations. The National Center on Elder Abuse invited me to serve on their advisory board, helping develop best practices for identifying and prosecuting financial crimes targeting vulnerable seniors. This work involved traveling throughout the United States to speak at conferences, train law enforcement personnel, and consult with attorneys' general offices developing new approaches to financial abuse prosecution. The national platform allowed me to influence policy and practice in ways that multiplied the protective impact of my individual casework. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from within my own family as William and Patricia came to understand how completely their gender bias and blind loyalty to Danny had corrupted their judgment about their children's character and capabilities. Their acknowledgement of these mistakes was both personally healing and professionally validating. During a family dinner at my new home in Lincoln Park, William raised his wine glass in a toast that summarized the journey we had all traveled from family dysfunction to professional redemption. His words reflected genuine understanding of how his prejudice had nearly prevented me from discovering my true potential. To Catherine, whose courage and integrity saved our family from complete disgrace, while building something more meaningful than anything we could have left her through inheritance. Your success proves that the greatest gift we can give our children is the opportunity to discover their own path rather than simply following ours. The toast was emotional for all of us because it acknowledged not just my professional success, but the personal growth that had made that success possible. Being forced to build my own career from nothing had taught me resilience, independence, and clarity about my own values that traditional inheritance could never have provided. My story had also influenced other families struggling with similar conflicts between tradition and individual potential. I regularly received letters from young women whose families discouraged their career aspirations, seeking advice about how to pursue professional goals despite familial opposition. I always encourage these women to remember that family opposition often reflected fear and misunderstanding rather than malice, and that persistence and professional excellence could eventually change minds that initially seemed closed to new possibilities. My own experience proved that apparent rejection could sometimes lead to opportunities that exceeded original dreams and aspirations. The broader lesson of my journey extended beyond gender discrimination to fundamental questions about courage, integrity, and the importance of standing up for vulnerable people, even when doing so requires personal sacrifice. Danny's crimes had victimized dozens of elderly people who trusted professionals to protect their interests, and exposing those crimes had required risking everything I thought I wanted to achieve what I actually needed to become. Looking back on the devastating conversation in my father's office that had started this entire journey, I could see that being rejected from Sullivan and Associates had actually been the best thing that ever happened to my professional development. Traditional inheritance would have limited me to maintaining someone else's legacy rather than building something uniquely mine that reflected my own values and priorities. The forced independence had also taught me that true professional satisfaction comes from meaningful work that helps vulnerable people rather than from traditional markers of success, like prestigious partnerships or inherited practices. Building my own firm allowed me to align my daily work with my deepest values in ways that would not have been possible as an employee of someone else's organization. As I prepared to speak at yet another conference about financial fraud prevention, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that day when I walked out of my father's office with nothing but my bar exam notes. That apparent ending had actually been a beginning opening possibilities that I could never have imagined while I was focused on inheriting rather than creating. What advice would you give to someone facing family opposition to their professional dreams? Have you ever discovered that apparent setbacks actually open better opportunities than you originally thought you wanted? Please share your thoughts in the comments below and remember to like this video if my story resonated with your own experiences. I want to thank everyone who listened to my story and encourage you to subscribe for more content about overcoming professional challenges and building meaningful careers despite family conflicts. Please share this video with anyone who might benefit from hearing about how rejection can sometimes lead to greater success than acceptance ever could. Remember that your worth is not determined by other people's recognition or approval, and that sometimes the greatest gift life gives us is the opportunity to prove ourselves independently, rather than simply inheriting what others have built. Stay strong. Trust your abilities and never give up on dreams that reflect your authentic values and aspirations.